Well, good evening. It's time for us to go ahead and jump back into our study. Last week, we made our way through really the first time in a long time that we were doing a review from the very beginning and working our way through the Old Testament. We just finished, for those of you who maybe haven't had the opportunity to be a part of the study for a little bit, we just finished going through the prophets as we are at the end now of what we call the Old Testament, or that is all of the text surrounding the first covenant that was given to the nation of Israel. And starting off from the very beginning, you will note, for those of you who are a little more observant, that the picture has changed just a little bit from 2 weeks ago. It was brought to my attention that perhaps we should make sure that we are continuing to use some of the language we have been talking about, bringing out, discussing, particularly that, since I wrote too small for you to be able to read what's on here, that is this line up here at the top, which represents the law of sin and death. What is the law of sin and death? Yeah, Joshua? Okay, so when you sin, you're sinning against God. You'll end up not going to heaven, but you will end up in hell or separated from God. Yep, that's exactly right. Isaac, what were you going to say? You sin, you die. That's probably the most succinct way to put that. You sin, you die. Where do you see this idea or concept first show up? Genesis 3, right? Or 2, I guess you could say, and then it's 3 that the serpent comes in and says, did God really say this? But the day that you eat of it, you will surely die. You break the law, you will die. Law of sin and death. This, by the way, permeates all time for all people. Everybody is under the law of sin and death. Who really brings this out and talks about this? Paul. In what letter? Romans. Remember when we went through Paul's letter to the Romans and we really brought this out? He talked about how death reigned from Adam to Moses, which means that what was in place even before the law of Moses? All right, there was a law in place before the law of Moses because without law there is no sin. And without sin there is no death. So that was Paul's point, Romans 5. And then in Romans 8 he explicitly uses this term. He says for what the law of Moses could not do, weak as it was through the flesh, God did in sending his own son, right? So he says, there's now therefore no condemnation for those who are under Christ, for he has set you free from the law of sin and death, is the language that's used there in Romans chapter 8 at the very beginning. So, all of this to say, at Genesis 3, when the fall takes place, again, is the fall in the text? Is that language used? No, it's just the language we've given to it, right? Just to kind of make sense of it. So, Genesis 3, we kind of denote there's a fall. Now there's a line of separation between man and God. Are we able to cross this line in and of ourselves? No. It's an impassable line from our end. But who can? Who can cross the line? God, right? You can. He can and does cross it from the other side. He can condescend. That is, he can come and be with us. But we'll get there. And we'll talk about the reunion up above this line at some point. That is the ultimate goal. So that's what this line is. It's a new edition, first time that I have drawn that with this picture. So I wanted to take a few minutes to explain that. Any questions or comments on that before we move on with our review? Nothing anybody wanted to add? All right. So, Kelly, just in case you want to grab the mic and have it available just in case. Since it's a review, we may not have very many comments or discussion points necessarily, but in case we do, I want to make sure we can make those available. All right, so we have Genesis 3. We worked our way through kind of the Genesis 1 through 11. It's kind of the introduction to the Bible. You would call it Israel's, or the world's even, primeval history. So that would be this point to Genesis 12. And who did God make promise to in Genesis 12? Abraham. What are the three promises we focus on? All right. Nation, land, seed. All right. Actually, that group came to be in Egypt. Whose story brought them down to Egypt? Whose narrative? All right, the story of Joseph brings them down into Egypt. Eventually, a Pharaoh rose who did not know Joseph, and they became enslaved. They were in bondage. Who brought them, or who was used by God to bring them out? All right, Moses. Moses led them to what mountain? Yeah. Mount Sinai. Yep, that's right. Mount Sinai. So God brings them to Mount Sinai where they're given what famous commands? The 10 Commandments. Very good. And then from that was Exodus chapter 20, chapters 21, 22, 23. You have the book of the covenant that's given to them. And finally in Exodus chapter 24, what do? You can say it louder, it's okay. Yes, they ratify their covenant. They enter into a covenant, right? This one shouldn't take that long. These are the questions that I'm throwing out right now that should just be like this. I know you guys, all you older folks have been trained by the kids to not say a word so they can give all the answers, but y'all can blast some of these out. You know your stuff, right? So Exodus 24, they're given their covenant. They enter into a covenant with God. At this point, they become a what? They become a nation. So the first of the promises are fulfilled here. Then, after they do this, they leave Mount Sinai, and God takes them up into the land. And how does that go? Well, they get up to Kadesh Barnea, and they send out the spies, and the people decide what? All right, they're afraid, we can't do this, we'd rather do what? All right, we'd rather die in Egypt or die in the wilderness. And what does God tell them? Okay, if that's what you want, you can die in the wilderness. That's fine. How long do they spend in the wilderness? Yes, Annalie? Okay, so they spend 40 days up in the wilderness 40 days spying out the land, right? But then how long do they wander? For 40 years. There you go. Yeah, all right, very good. So you got 40 years in the wilderness, and who then leads them into the land of promise? All right, Joshua, not Moses, but Joshua leads them across the body of water. All right, the Jordan River, which mimics exactly what the previous generation done at the Sea of Reeds, or the Red Sea. So they enter into the land, they take out the central part, the southern part, the northern part. They divide up They beat the armies, but what have they not done yet? All right, the people are still there. They haven't driven out the people. So when you get to Judges, it talks about all their success in driving out the peoples of the land, right? Yeah, not exactly. Instead, what would you characterize the book of Judges? What one word really would work? Failure. They just failed from the very beginning. You have the cycle of the judges that we talked about that repeats over and over, and yet everything tends to get worse as you go through. So it's more like a downward spiral than just a cycle. You get to the end of the Judges, and how does Judges end? What's the phrase at the end of Judges? Okay, all right. So you have Samuel said, a man from the hill country of Ephraim, which is the phrase that begins the last two, or at least it's there in the beginning of the last two narratives of Judges. But the very last book of, or very last verse in Judges, what does it say? All right. In those days there was no king in Israel, and what? Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. So, what? They need a king. Now we move into Samuel. And Samuel, this is where we ended up last week. We talked about the first king. Was he a regal individual? Yeah, not really, right? I mean, he shirked his responsibilities completely starting off. He refused to be a king. He tried to hide in the baggage. He didn't want to do it. When he found out in his most kingly moment that he has, when he saves the city of Jabesh Gilead, how does he find out that Jabesh Gilead is under attack? Where's he coming from? He's coming from the field where he's been out plowing a field, right? Instead of what? Instead of being king. I mean, he's still just completely rejecting who and what he is as God's anointed king. But it's that moment that he says, all right, it's time to be a king. He does so. He defeats Ammon and Nahash, who was the king. But what are his two big failures? What chapters? Do you remember, Annalie? Okay. Well, huh? Yep, that's exactly right. 1 Samuel chapters 13 and 15 mark Saul's two failures. The first one in 1 Samuel 13, what did he do? Hold that thought for just a second. In chapter 13, he was supposed to what? All right, wait for Samuel to offer the sacrifice. What did he do instead? All right, he waited for Samuel and then offered the sacrifice right before Samuel arrived, right? So he took it upon himself to do this thing, and God says, I would have given you an enduring dynasty. Instead, I'm going to give that enduring dynasty to someone who has a heart like mine. How did that battle go in chapters 13 and 14 against the Philistines? It could have gone a whole lot better if Saul would have gotten out of the way. Instead, he messes everything up. They don't have a great victory like they should have had, and things go south for them. So what about the next one, chapter 15? Isaac, you know what happens in that chapter? All right, they go into battle against the Amalekites, and he is told to destroy everything that is under the ban, utterly destroy, all kinds of words, ways to use this phraseology. I take it to mean everything that's on the battlefield. And does he do so? No. What does he spare? The king, first of all. That's a big no-no. And, all right, the cows, all the animals, right? that should have been killed on the battlefield. So, because he does this, God tells him, I'm going to remove the kingdom itself from you and give it to another. Then, that's as far, now we've caught up what we did 2 weeks ago. Yes. Yes. Yep. Yeah, Mary Martha says this is the time that God leaves Saul. And it's very significant. It says the Spirit of the Lord departed from Saul here in 1 Samuel chapter 15. And the Spirit of the Lord is going to come on to someone in the very next chapter. And so you have the departure in chapter 15. And then in chapter 16, we now introduce the next individual in the Kings. And who is that? All right, David. Chapter 16. What happens? First of all, let's remind ourselves, what is the structure of taking kingship that you see outlined, that should have been outlined with Saul but was not, but is outlined with David? There are 3 parts. What was that? All right, so what kind of anointing? All right, a private anointing. Very good. That should be followed up by a what? A demonstration of some sort. And then that would lead to a public coronation. All right, so chapter 16, you see David's private anointing, right? Samuel comes to Jesse's place, and he goes through all of the sons, and finally David's brought in, and he anoints David as king. Does David immediately take the throne? No, the same way that Saul was anointed early, in a private way, right? But Saul should have been able to have had a great demonstration if he had followed what Samuel told him to do. But when it came to the garrison that was there at Gibeah, did he take out that garrison? No, he didn't. He ignored it. He ignored everything. He tried to ignore the fact that he was even crowned. What about David? Where's David's great demonstration? Okay, but how did he demonstrate? Did he have any big military victories? Lucy, what'd you say? Yeah, the story over Goliath, right? This is that public demonstration to everybody, and it works after he does this. Which, by the way, remember when we talked about this, we talked about all of the callbacks to Genesis 3 and the serpent and the connection between the serpent and Goliath and all of that. He has a public demonstration by which the people rally behind him. Remember, Saul has slain his thousands, David his tens of thousands is the song. And then eventually he has to go on the run, go into hiding, because Saul still is the king, and because Saul's jealousy, he wants to kill David. Finally, after Saul's death at the end of 1 Samuel, the very beginning of 2 Samuel, David is then taken and he is made king over Judah and Israel both. All right, so just reminding of this, because believe it or not, this is not the last time we'll see these 3 aspects with a king in the line of David. I don't know if I can drift with foretelling anymore, but there may be some significance to some certain character and his taking all authority upon himself that follows this same kind of a pattern. Everybody picking up what I'm laying down? Okay, all right. In case you're not, Jesus. Just to make sure, Jesus will follow this exact same pattern when you get into the New Testament. All right, so that's David. Everything hunky-dory for David his entire time? Yeah, he still has some flaws, doesn't he? Namely, what? All right, very good. The story with Bathsheba. Who was Bathsheba? Yep, one of his soldiers' wife, one of his high end, one of his mighty men of valor. These great mighty men. His wife is the one that David has this whole thing with, Bathsheba, and you can list off a whole lot of the Ten Commandments, and that's exactly what David violates. Yeah, Mary Martha? Mm-hmm. Yeah, David was not a spring chicken during the time of this. He is old. He is closer to his death than he is to his prime when all of this takes place. Because remember, when Solomon is going to take the throne, Solomon, is he pretty advanced in years? Not really, right? Doesn't he say to God, I am but a what? You guys know this story, right? God says to Solomon, tell me what you want. And what does he say? I might just start calling on you guys. I think you know and you're just not talking. Let's get this. I am but a what? Yeah, I'm but a child. I'm but a youth. I don't know how to go out to war and come back in. The going out and the going, that. Give me wisdom to lead the people, right? Now, that doesn't mean that he's 3 years old or anything like that, but it means that he's not an aged individual, right? When was Solomon born? This is the story of David and Bathsheba. It is Solomon's origin story. Because after the child from their conception dies, David goes in to comfort his wife, Bathsheba, and she conceives, and who is born? Solomon. This is Solomon's origin story. Therefore, David is closer to his death than he is to his prime. But there's still a few more things that are going to take place during this time. Who's the son who rebels against him? Absalom. All right. And all of that is really what was described in the aftermath of the David and Bathsheba scandal when Nathan, God said that you will have a sword in your house. These things are going to take place. And really, David's own bad parenting led to all of that. All right. So all of this takes place. David eventually dies, and who is the next king? All right, Solomon. King? He starts off really well, doesn't he? He builds the temple. I think that's, a feather in his cap, isn't it? Yeah, he's known to be very wise. His wisdom is well known. People come from all over to see what his wisdom is like. You see some examples, illustrations of that. What's the money like during his time? The economy decent? Yeah, they didn't even, silver meant nothing. They treated silver like we treat pennies today, because it just meant absolutely nothing to them because of their wealth. Now tell me what he failed at. Jan, did you say Deuteronomy 17? Yes, that's exactly right. Deuteronomy 17 lists three things that it says when you come into the land and you say, give us a king like all of the other nations around us, then this is the way that you're going to do it. This is who you should choose. And that king should not do these three things. What are those three things? You remember? Okay, we're going to save that one for number 3, okay? But you nailed it, Josh. That's exactly right. So I'm going to have you do number 3 for us. All right. So don't accumulate. This might have been 2, but it could be 1. All right, so don't accumulate horses, especially from Egypt, right? Don't accumulate what? All right, don't accumulate money for yourself. And then Joshua, what was the third one? All right, don't marry foreign wives. These are the 3 things that it very specifically says, do not do this. Out of these 3, how many does Solomon do? Every single one. And the writer, the author of the Samuel account, the King's account, as you're going through, these are all next to each other. You're supposed to look at this and be taken over to Deuteronomy 17. This is a very clear connection to Deuteronomy 17. It's almost a reference that he's making. And this is what he does. And what's the end result of the foreign wives? All right, his heart turns from God. I don't know if that's the exact way. That's what it says in Deuteronomy 17, though, because they will turn your heart away from the Lord. Does his heart, though, does he ever just walk away from God, the Yahweh? What does it say? All right, continues to worship Yahweh, but he's also worshiping other gods as well. What does it say? His heart was what? Was not fully devoted to the Lord his God. But God's like, well, at least you gave me something, right? No, not at all. That's the problem. He allowed his heart to be turned to also include this, or include this, or include this. And with God, God says, no, this is an all or nothing thing right here. I don't share. You will have no other gods in my presence, right? So, all these things that he says, Solomon does them all. So what's the end result? What does God do? No, it doesn't kill him. What does he do, though? All right, now he says, I will take the kingdom and divide it up. And he's going to give the larger portion to whom? Okay, here's a guy named Jeroboam. All right, and he's going to be the first king of what people? All right, this is now going. So, Samaria, the capital. All of these can refer to the northern nation of Israel. What about down here? Who's the king down here? All right, this is now Rehoboam. And what's this nation down here? All right, this is Judah. Remember, this is split, 1 Kings chapter 12, when the people came to Rehoboam and said, hey, you know what, just be nice. Don't be like your father, just be nice. We will serve you. We'll do whatever you say. And he took counsel with the older folks, took counsel with the younger folks. Who did he listen to? The younger folks who said, look, if you give them an inch, they'll take a mile. You got to show them who's boss right away. And he said, you thought it was bad with my father. He used whips to punish you. I'll use scorpions. And what did the people say? Yep. Yeah, what portion do we have with David? To your tents, O Israel. What portion do we have with David? To your tents, O Israel. And so we begin with this nation up here. This is where, by the way, we just started skipping a whole lot of the narratives and the stories. Up here, give me an example of a bad king in the north. All right, Ahab. I don't know if you heard Isaac or not, but when you think of wicked, bad kings, Ahab should come to your mind right away. Which is highly unfortunate for Ahab, because I don't think he was that bad of a guy. What was his problem? He was a weak individual with a wife who bullied him and a wife who led him to do all kinds of bad things. And don't get me wrong, I'm not trying to condone his behavior in any way, shape, or form, give him a pass at all. I just think he is a product of I took it off, but marrying foreign women and what they do to your heart, how they take it away. And she became the driving factor with a lot of the things that Ahab is credited with, a lot of the evil things that Ahab is credited with. Naboth and his vineyard, that was Jezebel. Seeking after Elijah, that was Jezebel. Yeah, Mary Martha? Mm-hmm. Yeah, the northern nation of Israel was comprised of 10 of the original tribes that you had. And remember when God sent Ahijah the prophet to Jeroboam, he ripped up a cloth and gave 10 pieces to Jeroboam and said, this is what God is giving you. However, he will keep down here for Judah a remnant, or at least a kingdom down here in Judah, because of the promises that he made to whom? David. I missed that, didn't I? We got to backtrack, guys. We got to pop it in reverse here real quick. I flew right by one of the key passages, and we can't just fly by one of the key passages. So we're just going to put a little pause right here. We'll come back to it in a second. Let's just reverse. If I could do it, I'd do the whole reverse sounds and walking backwards and all that, but I can't do it. I've tried. So we'll just pretend like we did. In David's time, you have another one of the key passages. This is before the whole situation with Bathsheba. David came to Nathan. Nathan was the prophet at the time. And he said, I want to do what? I want to build a temple for God. I'm living in a nice, beautiful house, and God's still living in what? He's still living in a tent. Is that right? No, that's not right. So, he says, I want to do it. And Nathan said, that sounds great. Go for it. And then who intervened? And then God came to Nathan and said, no. Why not? Why was David unable to build that temple? Yeah? Okay, because he was a man of war. Does that mean that someone who enacted in warfare was automatically ruled out? All right, his son was going to do it. Yeah. But what was David doing? Fighting wars, yeah. Yeah, I need more than that. Okay. David's job, finish the conquest. God very specifically was not placing his name somewhere permanently until they had finished what they were supposed to have started with Joshua. And as it was, they hadn't finished yet, right? There were still pockets of resistance. When Saul dies, he dies fighting whom? The Philistines. They still had not overcome them. When Saul died, where was this? Who controlled the city of Jerusalem? The Jebusites. They didn't even have the capital city that's going to be the main capital city for Israel. They didn't even control it when David took the throne. David's job, his role in this whole thing was, as God said, I will plant my people. It's not that the fact that he shed blood or that he killed someone or that he fought in a war disqualified him. It's that it's not his job. It's not his role. His role is to finish the conquest. And did he do it? You go to 1 Kings chapter 4. I really hope it's chapter 4. That's what I have in my head. 1 Kings chapter 4. And what does it say about the land? What did they control? Yeah, this is where you see the land promise is fulfilled. What's that? 20 and 21. I had verse 21 in my head, but I wasn't brave enough to actually say it. So, all right. So 1 Kings 4, 20 and 21. And right in there it talks about the people being numerous, right? As the sands of the sea, I believe that is also right there in that section. This is talking about the fulfillment of promises. The promises given to Abraham have now been fulfilled. David finished the job. His job was to secure the land, and then the next guy would be the guy to build the temple. So God says, you are not able to build my house, but what does God say he will do? Yep. That's right, exactly right. So he said, God said to David, I will build a house for you forever and ever. He promised an enduring dynasty for him. What, by the way, what passage? All right, 2 Samuel chapter 7. And this is the promise to David of that enduring dynasty that would last forever. There would always be a king on the throne, the eternal kingdom. All right, so that is fourth key passage, Genesis 3, 12, Exodus 24, 2 Samuel 7. All right, very good. Now, we come back to Rehoboam, who is the king down in the south in Judah. So now Israel is split into two kingdoms. We're still talking about Jeroboam up here. And the time you have the kings, Ahab was a really, really bad king. By the way, was Ahab prominent from a political spectrum? Not really. Nobody really talked about Ahab. They talked about his daddy. Who was his daddy? Omri. Omri is the one that all the nations around them were concerned about. Omri was the guy who had the dynasty, but God's not concerned in these. If you want to know the stuff that they did as king and the political situation and all of that, he says, go look at the Chronicles of the Kings, which, by the way, is not the book of Chronicles, right? It's something that we don't have. But the King's account and the Chronicles account, both of them, recount this. They look at how well this person was from a spiritual evaluation. That is their relationship with God. Were they good? Were they wicked? Did they do good? Did they do bad? Did they lead the people into God's goodness or lead the people into error? That's the stuff that God is concerned with. And Ahab was awful. Name one of the people. Remember, there's a spiritual evaluation at the end for each of the kings. Name one of the kings in the north that was given a positive spiritual evaluation. Y'all didn't fall for that one. I see a lot of head shaking. Yeah, there's none. Not a single king in the north is given a spiritual positive evaluation. The closest that you would get is which king? Jehu. Yep. Jehu was prominent in eradicating Baal worship and trying to drive. He's the one that drove out Ahab, Jezebel, all of them. He drove out or killed, you could say, the worshipers, the priests and everything of Baal and Ashtoreth, all of that. But he never did what? All right, he didn't destroy the high places. What high places? Mm-hmm. No, not the 8-year-old king. Yeah, remember Jeroboam, one of his first acts as king was to say, if these people, here we go. So, whatever. If these people go all the way to Jerusalem, let's just say our line is right here. It's going to annoy me. All right. Let's say our line is about right here. If these people go all the way to Jerusalem, by the way, not to scale, you guys know that. It's probably more like up here, but just take it for what it is. If these people go to Jerusalem to worship the way they're supposed to from up here, what's going to happen? What's going to happen if they keep going to Jerusalem? Yeah, they'll say, why did we ever leave in the first place? They'll feel nostalgic for the united kingdom together. They'll return back to their king, the line of David. He's scared that if they keep going back and keep reminding themselves in Jerusalem about what life was like before, that they'll reunite, and then you have one too many what? You have one kingdom, but two kings. What happens to the superfluous one? He's killed, right? And in that scenario, that's Jeroboam. They'll return to Rehoboam. They'll kill Jeroboam. He says, I can't let that happen. So he puts, he creates 2 golden calves, puts one here in Bethel, one up here in Dan. And he says, behold your gods who led you up out of the land of Egypt, right? It's too much for you to go all the way to Jerusalem, worship here. And the people said, that's dumb. We should go to Jerusalem because that's what God wants us to do, right? No. Yeah, that's right, Joshua. They're like, oh, sweet. Yes. It's exactly right, Joshua. So, they go and worship here. What king from the north finally took these down? Anybody? Joshua or Samuel, do you remember? Nobody. That's exactly right. Nobody did it. That's why Jehu, as good as he might have been, is still given a negative spiritual evaluation because he never took down the altars that were erected by Jeroboam in Dan and Bethel. in which Jeroboam led the people to sin. Eventually, this northern nation finds its demise in what year? No? Say the full number. 722, yes. In 722 BC, who brings the northern nation of Israel to its end? Assyria. Yeah, the Assyrians come down, they surround Samaria, and they take Samaria out. They transplant all of the people away. Presumably, they bring people from somewhere else and put them into the land. And at this point, the land of Israel, Ephraim, Samaria, all of that comes to its conclusion. So that is the tale of the north. By the way, when would Jeroboam have taken control? When would he have become king? Generally speaking, we put Saul at what? 10. And we typically put 40 years is an easy way to remember. 40-year reign for Saul. So David takes the throne when? 10:10. Reigns for about 40 years. Until who takes the throne? Solomon in what year? I know, math. This is a hard one. 970, right? Temple built what year? Temple built 967, I think. And so, real early in his reign. 30 years for Solomon puts you around what year? Approximately 930 or so. For when this would have taken place. So you've got about 200-year time period, and the northern nation of Israel meets its demise. All right. That's where we're going to have to put a pause in this. Yes, Joshua? Yes, we'll talk about that. Although he's going to be more than 8 years old when he does it, but he becomes king when he's 8. And he's going to be out here somewhere when he does that. So it's going to be well after that's done. All right, but very good, Joshua. You are exactly right. He is the one who finally does what needs to be done. But he's not a king up here. He's going to be a king down here. And we'll talk about Judah and their time frame next week. All right. Any questions or comments before we conclude our study? Okay. All right. Well, we will bring that to its conclusion. All right. Good class, guys. Thanks a lot.